This passage is a reminder that you are living behind enemy lines. Do you ever feel like that? That you're living behind enemy lines? Do you ever feel like you're living in enemy territory? Like there's a war going on and you're waiting for reinforcements? If you're a Christian, if you belong to the church, then that should be your normal experience. That is because, despite the fact that we live in this world, we are now citizens of the world to come. The world that Jesus will usher in when he comes back. A world remade, restored, perfected. When he cleanses this world and all the wrongs in it and brings to fruition all that is right. Brothers and sisters, Jesus has risen. He has overcome the enemies of sin and death, and he now reigns at the Father's right hand. And as we confess and affirm most weeks, he will come to judge the living and the dead. He is coming back to put a final end to his mortally wounded enemies and remake the world. But the church right now exists waiting for the day when Jesus will come back, when the servant of the Lord will return and wipe away tears and crush all evil under his feet. And while we wait, we live behind enemy lines. So let's make no mistake, there is a war going on between those who belong to this world and its ruler, and those who belong to the risen Jesus and the world that he is ushering in, between those who conspire against the coming king and those who have made their peace with him. And although we're only going to be looking at chapter 10 in any detail, chapters 10 all the way to chapter 12 paint a picture for us of what it will be like when the servant of the Lord comes to save his people and to crush his enemies. Let's be clear, Joshua is the servant of the Lord, and he is here a picture for us of Jesus, the coming servant, and the victory he will bring. And it's given to us, it's given to you this morning to give you confidence while you wait. Confidence of the victory he will bring, but confidence also that we will really be saved when he returns. Now, maybe you're sat here already and thinking, I don't feel as at war as I should. Well, really, if that is you, my prayer is that as you see the certainty of the victory that Jesus will bring, and as you see the surety of the salvation he brings for individuals, it will galvanize you, it will encourage you to more wholeheartedly put your faith and trust in the coming King. And as you do so, I guarantee you'll see enmity with the world grow and grow. I only have 3 points this morning as we go through. There was a lot of points on my last sermon in Joshua. None of them are particularly profound or kind of particularly amazing. But hopefully as you walk through this passage, you'll see how each of them get highlighted from this text. The first heading is this: peace with God's servant. So let's remember the inhabitants of Gibeon. So Gibeonites are mentioned there in verse 1. The Gibeonites, if you remember, they were God's enemies. But in chapter 9, they have made peace with God's chosen servant. They've made peace with Joshua. And as a result, they now live behind enemy lines. So do you remember how peace was made between God and his people and the Gibeonites? It was made through a lie and deception. So the Gibeonites, who were God's enemies, came to Joshua and God's people, and they came in for the wrong reasons, and they came in the wrong way, and they still found grace. Isn't that an incredible thing? They came to the servant of the Lord for the wrong reasons and in the wrong way, and they still found grace and mercy by coming to him. He made peace with them and made them servants in the house of God. And it is such an incredible reminder. You might have come to Jesus for rubbish reasons. But if we do come to him, we will find that he is more gracious than we deserve. Just think about some of the prayers you've prayed, and they are full of, dubious motives at best and half-hearted ones very often. And yet the Lord hears you and he answers, not because of the quality of your prayer or the goodness of your heart, but because of the grace of the servant of the Lord. It's an incredibly encouraging reminder. However, making peace with God's servant automatically makes you at war with the world. So I'm not sure how long the Gibeonites had been at peace with Adonai Zedek and the other kings of the south. And I'm not really sure of the nature of their relationship. I'm not sure if they're just trading partners or whether they'd made it onto each other's Christmas card list. Is this a deep and intimate connection, or is it kind of a relationship of convenience? However, as soon as the news makes it to these kings of Canaan that the Gibeonites had made peace with God, the Gibeonites become their enemy. As soon as peace is made with God, they become their enemy. No more Christmas cards, just conflict. So just look at verse 3 and 4 with me, because boy, does it ramp up quickly. The world begins wars with those who belong to God. But you know that, don't you? Like Jesus has made it very clear. In John 15, he tells you that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it's hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you, he says. And we do feel that acutely in lots of ways. The enmity, the separation, the division that comes from saying to the world, I'm at peace with the one that you're at war with. It can be little things, like people trying to make us feel small or feel embarrassed for saying that we know the God of the Bible, or make us feel embarrassed for the things that the God who made heaven and earth has said in his word about how we should live in his world, or trying to make us out to not be very loving when we're living and speaking for the God of love. Maybe you're experiencing that, but it can also be seen in much bigger things, can't it? Here in Joshua 10, we have a vivid and sobering picture of just how much the world hates those who make peace with God, so much that the world goes to war. A war that, if you are experiencing, is just a foretaste of the great opposition on the final day. We live in a world where Christians are put to death for claiming Christ as their own. Where they are politically persecuted, where they are ostracized, alienated for calling upon the name of the Lord. The world hates the one who says they are sinners and that he has come to save them. Why do they hate that? Because he comes, and to say that means that I have to acknowledge that I might not be the one that's in charge, but also that I might be guilty before the one who actually is. To say that Jesus has come to bring forgiveness is to admit that we are guilty. And so the world makes war with the one who comes to show grace. And like the Gibeonites, while they wait for Joshua to come, so we wait, don't we? Like Gibeonites, waiting for the Lord Jesus to come, to put an end to the war. Those who have peace with God's servant are at war with the Lord. Here's my second heading. With the world. Here's my second heading. The prayer of God's servant. So just take a look at verse 6. Again, the message comes down, doesn't it, from the Gibeonites, and it makes it to God's chosen servant Joshua in Gilgal. Now remember what's just happened in Gilgal. The great covenant has been reaffirmed. God has put his blessing upon his people, assured that his presence is with them. And so the news has come down the wire. We need rescuing. Send reinforcements. And so in verse 7, we're told that Joshua assembles all the men that he has. He does not send in, he does not just send in a few, not just the best trained. Every single man of war and the mighty men of valor assemble. Think of that for a moment. I think, here's a silly illustration. It's like when you ask a friend of a friend of a friend, to do something pretty big for you. And you think, he's not going to help me, really. It's a long shot at best. Like, he might come and come to my aid. And we kind of hope that you might send a few people to help me out. And then imagine the whole town shows up to help you with whatever your issue is. All the expertise, all the strength, all the manpower you could ever need at your disposal. Like, that's what's going on here. I reckon the Gibeonites are going, maybe they'll send a few people to help me out. But the servant of the Lord, he brings everyone. He brings everyone. And he does not hesitate to come to save those who belong to him. What an incredible promise that is. All the host of heaven. And there is no hesitation. He comes and brings the guaranteed surety of victory. He does not hesitate to save those who call upon his name. But then look at verse 10 onwards, because not only does he bring all of those who are going to fight, but the battle takes a miraculous turn. In lots of ways, its strategy and skill are put to the side because God steps in to secure the victory. It's an incredible moment. So just look at verse 10. You have to flick over your page if you've not done it. As the battle takes this miraculous turn, the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Ezkah and Makkedah. God casts confusion on the enemies, and then do you remember what he did as we read the story? He cast confusion down from heaven, and then hailstones. Hailstones down from heaven. There is that great detail. Just look at the end of verse 11. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So people read texts like this and go, it's so gruesome, like it's awful, look at what they did with the sword as they went and marched through. And the little detail there is, don't forget, this is the Lord's doing. He rains these stones from heaven. Joshua fights, but he is winning because God fights for him. God bends his creation to accomplish his purposes, the salvation of his people. Nothing makes that clearer than what happens in verse 12, does it? So the battle is clearly being won, but it's getting dark. And they're losing light to see the enemy, And so Joshua prays. Now, what would you pray? Isn't that an interesting thing? In this moment, as you've seen all of the armies of God's people going, the enemy has been thrown into confusion, and then hailstones are raining down. What does Joshua pray? Well, he prays this: sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And God answers. Verse 13, the sun stands still and the moon stopped until the nation is able to take vengeance on all their enemies. This is so unbelievable. So when you read stories like this is the kind of story that your friends read in the Bible and go, there is no way that you can believe in Christianity. Look, things like this happen. But Joshua knows it's so unbelievable that he has to write that little note just to make out clear how amazing this is by mentioning he is not only the one who recorded the event, that it was completely unique, but he also reminds us that it doesn't happen every day. Stuff like this just does not happen. Like, we were as amazed as you are that God kept the sun shining so that we could win the victory. And what is clear from this moment, as if the creator of all things needs to keep the sun shining through the night to secure the salvation of his people, then he'll do it. Whatever is required to save you, he will bend heaven and earth to do so. If he needs to cause hail to fall from heaven so that our enemies don't overtake us, he can do it. The God of all creation has all things at his disposal to secure the salvation of his people. And this passage is incredible because it tells us that this remarkable moment, what is remarkable about it is not because the sun stood and shone, as amazing as that is. The real reason that this passage is amazing, according to what it says, is that the Lord heeded the voice of a man. Did you notice that? Look at verse 14. He doesn't say, it's amazing that the sun kept shining through the night. He says, there has never been a day like it, because never has God listened to the voice of a man like he did that day. God has never listened to the prayer of a man to secure the salvation of his people like he did that day. Joshua lifted his voice and praised to God, asking for the very thing that will save his people, and the sun stood still. It shone through the night so the victory could be gained. Nothing like it has taken place. That is, until the true and better Joshua, the true servant of the Lord, lifted up his voice and prayed for the salvation of God's people, until he prayed for your salvation. The moment when the servant of the Lord hung on the cross, at war with the great enemy of his people, sin and death, and he prayed and cried out to God the Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the gospel writer, Matthew, makes this important narration in that moment. What happens? Instead of the sun shining through the night, the sun ceased to shine in the middle of the day. When God answered the prayer of his chosen servant, God answers the prayer of the true and better Joshua. But the time the sun stopped shining, as God's servant bowed his head and died on the cross to pay for their sins and deal with the death they deserve, all so that God's people can be saved. Jesus defeated your enemies by the prayer of the servant of the Lord. Joshua wins this victory for Israel by God answering his prayer, but Jesus wins his victory for you by God answering his. But one thing I do just want to highlight before we move on to our next point. Jesus has not stopped praying. Jesus has not stopped praying. 3 days after the dark day of the cross, the Son of Righteousness rises and he ascends into heaven, and there the servant of the Lord prays for his people. While we await the day when Jesus returns to bring to completion all that he has won through the cross, while we await the day when Jesus returns and comes back and defeats all his and our enemies that have already lost all their power through his cross, we can wait with confidence, knowing that God will protect his people, or to use the words of verse 14, that God will fight for his people. That those who have made peace with God's chosen servant will be safe until that day, because God Almighty fights for his servant. God's servant will move heaven and earth to secure your salvation. And so when you feel like the enemy is gaining strength around you, remember how God has answered the prayer of Jesus, and how Jesus even now is praying, interceding for you right now while you wait his return. Reinforcements are coming in the person of Jesus Christ. But until that day, Jesus Christ stands interceding for you. And as James tells us, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And Jesus is the righteous man at God's right hand, and his prayers avail everything for you. There is nothing that you need that he will not provide. You will be kept safe until the final victory comes. But this is our final heading: the crushing of God's servant. I think the scene changes pace quite a lot in verse 16, doesn't it? Because in the midst of all of this warfare and scattered enemies, the camera turns and it swings and focuses in on a cave filled with 5 kings. These kings have escaped the hailstones. They have sought refuge in this cave, but this cave has now become their tomb. Joshua tells his men to roll stones in front of the mouth of the cave and set guard while the rest of their enemy armies are defeated. And after the victory, Joshua arrives at the cave and the kings are brought out. So you have to kind of look all the way down now at verse 22. And then in verse 24, Joshua commands them to do something which seems a bit gruesome and unnecessary, doesn't he? Put your feet on their necks. Why would he say that? Put your feet on their necks. It's almost as though these kings are to be crushed under the feet of God's people. The crushing that God's servant brings is hard to read, but just read verse 24 with me again. So they brought out the kings out to Joshua, and Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." Then they came near and put the feet on their necks. We naturally recoil at this scene of what is described, don't we? But remember, more is going on than simply a display of authority and power. Just look at verse 25. The people of God are not to be afraid, but to be strong and courageous. Now, where have we heard that before? Well, it's chapter 1, verse 6. But what comes only a few verses earlier in verse 3 is this: the promise that every place the sole of your feet will tread upon, I have given to you. Land and enemies have been given to the servant of the Lord, and the sign of that is that they are all placed under his feet. The crushing of these kings is sobering, but it is a signpost to the day when Jesus will put all things under his feet. This is a picture of the just judgment of God that the servant of the Lord will bring when he comes to save the people that he has died for. This is the moment when the offspring of Eve crushes the serpent's head. It is the risen King Jesus realizing his reign in all the earth as the enemies are put under his feet. The nations rage and the kings of the earth might set up their thrones against him, but they will be made his footstool when he returns. There will be a day when all evil is eradicated, all opposition to his righteous reign removed. We all long for that day, for the day that corruption and curse is trampled under Jesus' feet. When the servant of the Lord comes, and so his people don't need to be afraid anymore. But then did you see what happens? Verse 26. They're hung on trees, a sign of God's curse coming upon them. And verse 27, they're sealed in a cave forever, a sign of the permanent penalty of death, being crushed, hung on a cross, and closed in a cave, is what it comes to for the enemies of God. Those who do not have peace with God will have to endure the divine curse of being crushed, hung, and buried. It's a picture of what is coming, but doesn't it make you just gasp in awe? Because you look at that and you go, I can't believe the victory is coming. But why are you standing on the right side of history? Why are you aligned with this king? It is because he was crushed for you. He was hung on a cross for you and sealed in a tomb for you. You read this story and you should be thinking, were it not for him, this would be me. Were it not for him, this would be me. I would have had to bear that curse myself. This is the fate of rebels against God. I hope you feel that. These kings are paying for their own sins. But the good news of the gospel is that we do not have to. The peace we have with God is because the penalty is paid by the servant of the Lord. Brothers and sisters, we are behind enemy lines. But because we have peace with God's servant, the victory is sure. Reinforcements are coming, and you will be kept until the end.